In this episode, Serenity Now for Entrepreneurs is joined by Jae-Yeon Lim of Harris Company, a lawyer who helps foreign workers with immigration support in Canada. Foreign workers are in high demand in a range of industries, especially when looking for skilled workers to fill vacant positions that lack the talent pool needed. Where did Jay identify potential risks as an employer looking to hire a foreign worker?
I think it's really important for employers to know what their legal obligations are when they're involved in this process, because again, the wrong information can be detrimental for not only the foreign worker, but also the employer. I think what's important is that once they have the right protocol for compliance within the system and they get that education, like educating HRs about this process is really, really important to make sure that you're staying compliant, then I think it'll help the company to maintain that internally.
Do you struggle with finding new hires for your business? This episode covers many opportunities to learn about bringing in foreign workers to Canada. Learn what is involved in the process, what to look out for, and what the best practices are before you engage in hiring foreign workers. We hope that this episode will bring you some serenity now. Let's take a listen. Welcome to another episode of Serenity Now for Entrepreneurs. We have Jae-Yeon Lim joining us from Harris Company, and she's going to be sharing some very useful information and important information about foreign workers and different programs here in Canada associated with this community. Welcome, Jay.
Welcome, Jay, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you listening, Jay was introduced to me by a mutual colleague that works at the same company that she works at, and I had reached out to him asking if he knew anybody that could speak to us about this topic. And he came back very quickly and very enthusiastically, introducing me to Jay. So I've been very happy to get to know her over the last couple of weeks. And so, Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and maybe a little bit why you do it?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on Serenity Now for Entrepreneurs. I'm so happy to be here and happy to help entrepreneurs and small businesses in any way I can with my knowledge. I've been an immigration lawyer for 10 years. I've been called in Ontario and British Columbia, and immigration is something I always felt very passionate about. Few people know about my personal history with immigration, but what happened is I came to Canada at the age of 10 with my parents. My parents went and made a mistake of going to the wrong person who shouldn't be giving the legal advice. This person unfortunately filed the wrong paperwork, which was sent to the wrong office. And one thing after the other, we ended up with refusals and were on the brink of getting deported from Canada. And it was a very traumatic and stressful time for myself and for my parents. One thing I can say about immigration process is that anyone who comes through it knows how vulnerable you can feel, especially when things can go wrong. And when things go wrong, they can go wrong very fast. And luckily for us, my parents turned to the right help, and we have been able to become Canadian citizens. And here I am as an immigration lawyer.
Thanks for
that.
Oh,
that's interesting. That's good to know. So you were kind of called to it at a very early age in a way. Maybe just for those listening, because they may not be aware, maybe you could explain to us exactly what a foreign worker is.
Yes. So I think what we can say is first is who's a foreigner and who can work in Canada. So under the Canadian laws, people that can work in Canada legally are Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and then foreign nationals. We call them foreign nationals. So actually, believe it or not, some visitors can work if they have the right authorization. There's also students, international students, if they have the correct authorization. And then foreign workers are the ones that are work permit holders. So government will issue a document that's a work permit document that has very specific conditions that they have to abide by, including who they can work for, what occupation, where the job can be located, etc. And then under those conditions, they can engage in work in Canada.
So Jay, I love your story. I think it's really important that you have gone through the process yourself. So tell us a little bit more about the Foreign Workers Program. Like this, there seems to be a program available here in Canada, but I don't think a lot of entrepreneurs know about it.
Yes, there are lots of programs available to hire foreign workers in Canada. The main divide between work permit programs is mainly between two, which is first is if you need something called labor market impact assessment. It's a labor market test where employers have to advertise for minimum 4 weeks unless they're exempt, apply to Service Canada, and once they get the approval, then with that approval, the foreign worker can then apply for a work permit. The other stream is under what's called International Mobility Program, where foreign workers don't need the employers to apply for LMIA, and they can apply directly for a work permit. There are very specific types of scenarios which I can talk about, but basically, the ideal scenario for many small businesses, I would say, is to try to find pathways to work permits for foreign workers without needing the LMIA, because LMIA process is not only time-taking, it can take up to 2 months or longer depending on the stream. And also the processing fee is $1,000 per position. So if you're wanting to hire 3 people under that program, you have to pay $3,000 of processing fees.
So when does it make sense then for a business to use the foreign workers program?
Yes, that's a great question. I would say from what I have seen, businesses want to scale up and want to diversify the workforce, want to bring in skilled workers and global talents. And also in Canada, we have aging population and low birth rate. We have a severe labor shortage, which is another reason why the government announced just last week that they're intending to increase a target to bring in close to 500,000 newcomers every year for the next 3 years.
Wow,
That's
a
awesome.
lot.
That's needed, though. You can tell when you go to restaurants and stores and those kinds of things that we have a certain, labor shortage. That's good to hear.
My accounting office.
Your accounting office, everybody that I talk to
Yeah.
in business is looking for someone to hire, for sure.
Yeah, and many of my clients who have been advertising for a while have not had applications. That's the problem.
Wow, where are all the
People are not
people
applying.
gone?
So could you clarify a little bit? You said that there's other routes to work permit other than LMIAs. Are there programs that have names, or like maybe you could give us an example of what one of those paths might be?
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
understand. I'm completely ignorant of the whole process.
Oh, that's completely okay. Now, just to warn you, I hope I don't talk your ears off. There's a lot of details, so feel free to stop me anytime. I thought I would maybe mention the one first that is probably most feasible for small businesses in mind, that offers most flexibility. So what I was going to suggest is looking into hiring people that already have open work permits. So work permits are 2 different kinds. So it can be open or closed. Open means you can work in any occupation for any employer. Closed means you can only work for a specific employer and only in that occupation that's named in that document. So when people are coming into Canada under open work permits, usually it's under very specific programs, like, for example, International Exchange Canada. So it's called IEC program, where people have working holiday programs that has bilateral relationship between their country and our country, and they can work in any jobs in Canada and for any employer. So for small businesses, for example, it'd be really great to hire these people, because then if you want them to work in a specific role and then move them up, you can do that without having to worry about certain compliance issues. One thing I want to note, though, about open work permit is that open work permits can still have certain restrictions. So it's important to still get legal advice to make sure that you're verifying their status to make sure they can work in that role and that work location.
So when they get that open status, wouldn't they already be coming here for a particular job then? So are you hiring them away from somebody else? Or do they arrive with a permit and not a job?
So the one I mentioned is the IAC Open Work Permit when the Working Holiday Program. They are coming to Canada with no job offer, and they have the ability to work in any jobs. And then the other example I can give you is post-graduation work permits. So these are for international students who've completed eligible programs in Canada and who have applied for this program called post-graduation work permits. And if they're eligible, then they can be issued this open work permit that's between 8 months to 3 years, depending on the type of program they had taken in Canada. And so that allows them to work in any jobs and for any employer. Again, this is really great because if you hire them and they have these open work permits, they can continue working for that employer, build their Canadian work experience so that they can work on their pathway to PR. And for the employer involved, they can, again, like easily move them in terms of occupations.
You know what?
Right.
I didn't realize it, but I think we've been hiring foreign workers all along, because I think we have currently 2 people in this position where they're working on their student visas. And then in come January, I think both of them are finished their programs and they will be able to work for us full time. So I wasn't even aware. So
Yeah. Actually, one thing I want to mention about that, and this is something I see all the time, is that when international students finish program, they have to stop working until they apply for a work permit. They don't have automatic right to continue to work under the regulation. So it's kind of specific.
okay.
Yeah, a lot of
And so-
minutia involved.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask about that as well, because there's got to be some best practices around applying for the foreign workers program. And maybe you could give us perspective from like, is there something that an employer needs to do? And then also for those who might be listening who are thinking about hiring people who are foreign workers, so that they understand from the applicant side of things, like what's required. So if you could cover some best practices on both sides, that'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really important for employers to know what their legal obligations are when they're involved in this process, because again, the wrong information can be detrimental for not only the foreign worker, but also the employer. Let me give you an example. I had an employer come into my office. This employer was looking desperately to hire 10 people for a position. And then a recruiter came along saying, I can promise you, guarantee 10 people that can work for you tomorrow. And they have legal status, so not to worry. And unfortunately, nobody actually really verified the work permit status. And it turns out the 10 people that he hired were visitors. So they didn't even have proper legal status to work in Canada. And somehow it was leaked to the government that this recruiter, who was actually unlicensed, was doing all this. And then he got audited as a result. And for hiring foreign workers illegally, he was fined. And then for the foreign workers involved, they were deported from Canada. So there's heavy consequences for both sides. Under the Immigration Act, actually, employers are required to verify the status of the foreign workers to make sure they have the correct authorization to engage in work, failing which they can be fined, like I mentioned, or in the worst case scenario, even imprisoned. So I think it's important to mention that's why it's important for them to get the correct legal advice to make sure that they're not in contravention. And then secondly, when you do hire foreign workers, and that's based on certain programs like the ones I mentioned, like either through the LMIA or LMIA exempt programs, employers still have obligations. So for example, now employers have to notify foreign workers about their rights in Canada on or before they start work. They have to have signed agreements in either English or French language of their choice. It has to be provided before or on the day they start work, for example. So all these duties are there, and it depends on which program that they hire under. They may have additional duties as well. So I think that's why it's important that they get that advice, and not to assume that people can just engage in work even if they're unpaid as volunteers. I have seen that often as well, that, oh, I'm sure it's okay because they're just coming in here to, and they're not really working because they're not paid. Actually, that's not true. Under the immigration regulations, if the activity is considered to be deemed to be in competition with Canadian permanent residents, that can be deemed as work, which requires a work permit. So I think people have the best intentions maybe, but by making certain choices they can end up in very difficult positions. So that's why I think getting that advice is really important. And maybe another thing is to make sure once you do hire them, make sure you get the legal opinion to make sure that you're not contravening conditions of the work permit. So because employers have to continue to provide the same occupation and substantially the same working conditions as set out in the job offer. So changing the occupation or changing their salary, work hours can mean that the employer can end up with hefty fines if they're audited. And employers can be audited for up to 6 years from the time the foreign worker has commenced work based on the work permit. So they have
you
to
can't
continue.
even change the salary.
No, you can. Again, it depends on the program that you hire them under.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
yeah, if there are substantive changes to certain terms, then that's something that you may have to disclose to the government before making those changes. So it really depends on the type of work permit program. If it's an LMIA-based program, then the government can take the position that because you have to advertise first to Canadian permanent residents about the job, they might take the position that you didn't offer that opportunity to Canadian permanent residents. So that's why it's important that you check which program.
Okay.
Wow. Sounds like there's a bit of overhead before you can really benefit from the, it does, but both from a work perspective and from a financial perspective. So you got to go into it thinking that this program is very valuable to your company. Obviously, getting workers is important, but you also have to be prepared to pay the legal costs, and you have to be prepared to put in the work associated with maintaining those agreements, right?
Yeah, I think what's important is that once they have the right protocol for compliance within the system and they get that education, like educating HRs about this process is really, really important to make sure that you're staying compliant, then I think it'll help the company to maintain that internally.
Especially if there's a volume of employees required, right? I think that's where I can see the benefit being best is like you say, making it a protocol you understand, having it in place so it's a known element in the company, and hiring a lot of workers under that might be beneficial for some.
And also supporting them to become permanent residents by offering them permanent job offers, which can help hopefully facilitate them into PR process, can also in turn help their company because then once they become PRs, then that's a different story.
Yeah, and you build loyalty too with your employees if you help them get to achieve their goals as well as you achieve yours, right?
Yes, definitely.
I'm not the HR person in my office, obviously. So I assumed that the foreign workers program was somebody that you actually went and found in another country and then did the process to bring them. But we've actually for years and years, we have all the contracts. And now that you mention it, we have all that stuff in place. It just didn't occur to me that was a foreign workers program. So.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that you found foreign talents. That's great.
So is there a place, Jay, that people can go to find the resources, like not just the legal aspect of it, which of course you guys can provide, but to actually find a list of available employees with certain skill sets? Is there somewhere that you can find that resource?
You mean for finding foreign workers?
Yeah. Is there a pool of available workers?
Well, when people are advertising on, for example, for the LMIA, one of the sites where they have to advertise is called Job Bank. And then Job Bank has certain candidates, and then they will automatically match certain candidates to the job posting
I see.
and match them with the employers. And then you can see like how many stars they have depending on how compatible they are with the job requirements.
Oh, so there is that place.
So you can invite them to apply for the job, for example. That's one way. In terms of resources about information and programs, I mean, you're certainly welcome to pay a visit to my website, our company's website. We always try to have some resources for employers because we are pretty much an employer-driven. We try to assist employers with employment matters and other matters, and also in immigration as well. I can also give you the link to Canadian Immigration Lawyers Association as well, which also has lots of articles that are helpful for employers about programs.
Yeah, we'll be certain to reference those in our podcast posting.
Yeah, those will be resources that we can list out absolutely in the description of the podcast, so look out for that. So Jay, we do something at Serenity Now called a quickfire round. And so this is an opportunity for us to think a little bit about what was shared in today's podcast, what resonated or aha moments that we might have, but also an opportunity for us to add in any additional experiences or things that we may have missed and really should be sharing with the audience as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start first with this one. And I'm going to say, it's really interesting to me to hear the goals of the Canadian government and how they want to increase, and the number I think is staggering, 500,000 foreign workers to come to Canada year over year until 2025, I believe. And so I'm excited to kind of hear that there's greater opportunity for Canada to grow and opportunity for others to come to Canada as well. So I thought that was a really interesting fact to share, because during COVID, we unfortunately had a scenario where the paperwork wasn't being processed fast enough. And so as a result, one of our team members actually had to leave Canada because their paperwork had expired. And so I'm sure, I see you nodding, so I'm sure that that has been something that you and your team have had to deal with. So hopefully there are better processes in place for the government to be able to process 500,000 applications every year, because definitely during COVID, things slowed down quite a bit. So that's kind of my insight on that.
Yeah, definitely. The government is on it too. They're fully aware of over 2.5 million applications in backlog, and I understand they are investing more resources to address the backlog. So more of an optimist here that hopefully we'll see some sort of page turning in the future, hopefully.
You could certainly feel the lack of immigration during COVID for sure. And with the accelerated rate of retirement and the baby boomers all retiring and the lack of immigration, we are in an interesting time. I keep asking the question, where did all the people go? But it makes a lot of sense what you're saying about, our immigration policy. Now, we kind of had I don't know, it was a complete stop during COVID. I'm not sure, but it certainly has left a lot of businesses. So this is really encouraging to hear.
Yeah, and we also hear the talks about recession and all these economic stress and pressure. So I think I read in the Global Mail the other day that the popular poll is actually quite in favor of immigration now more than ever. So with more people coming in, bringing in their resources and talents, I think it's really a great move forward to come out of the pandemic.
I was going to ask about student visas. So my understanding is here in the middle of November that, well, previously students were limited to 20 hours a week or something, and then come the middle of November, they're going to be allowed to work more. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the government, again, is addressing the labor shortage, and that's why for the post-graduation work permit that I mentioned earlier, they actually allowed a one-time extension by 18 months for people that have post-graduation work permits expiring from last year until this end of this year. I don't want to get into too much details about that, but anyway, they're trying to address it by having all these people with open work permits so they can work in any jobs and for any employers. But for students, you're right. Yes, the government has announced another temporary measure, and it's saying that starting mid-November this year until next year, for one time only, again, this is a pilot, that students can work in excess of 20 hours off campus during academic sessions, because they used to be only allowed to work up to 20 hours per week during academic sessions off campus. They can work more than that on campus, but the caveat is that they have the full-time students. And also the other caveat is that regardless, study permit holders are always beholden to the conditions of a study permit, which is that they have to be enrolled in their designated learning institution, and they have to maintain being enrolled. They also have to be actively pursuing their studies. Otherwise, they can run into enforcement scenarios where they could, in the worst case scenario, get deported from Canada.
So let me ask a clarifying question about that. So, we know that the school year goes from September typically until end of April. And then there's a lot of kids that will take the summer off. So when we say actively pursuing, are there different rules associated with student visa holders who are seeking to work where they will need to work and study throughout the entire year? Or is it reasonable to say, well, they're taking time off in the summer and they're going to be going back to school in the fall? What have you seen in terms of how that's viewed in the eyes of the government?
Just to clarify, students can work full-time during scheduled breaks. So scheduled breaks, meaning, for example, summer breaks, they can work full-time. They never had restrictions on working during scheduled breaks. In terms of the restrictions, it's off-campus work during school year academic sessions. Then they could only work up to 20 hours per week. They can work full-time on campus, provided they are full-time students.
Right. Okay.
Ouch.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, this was such a great quickfire. Usually we're just very, very short on the quickfires, but I think because this topic is so loaded with additional knowledge from you and information, I think it was great that we could ask some clarifying questions to help the listeners of Serenity Now understand more about the Foreign Workers Program. So Jay, thank you again for joining us on this episode. We're super happy to have you here sharing your expertise. And we know that this episode will bring our listeners some serenity now.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and picked up some good tips and best practices that would benefit your entrepreneurial journey. Remember, none of the content in this podcast should be relied upon as standard legal or business advice. Always consult a professional for your specific business. You may know someone who could benefit from this podcast. Please share it with your business community, and perhaps it can give an entrepreneur you know some serenity now.